As you're deciding, let me go through real quick what we discussed last week. These 7 chapters are meaningful to me. It took me a little while to come up with them. Of course, there wasn't anything spiritual about the way I came up with 7. That was the number of messages. But as it turned out, I think it's a great number to be able to tell a story. All right. The first chapter that I chose was Genesis chapter 3, because it answers life's questions. And for me, the idea of why do bad things happen? Why is there so much awful things? And in Judaism, we believe in sin. We believe in the Garden of Eden. We believe that Adam sinned. It's in the scripture. Now, not all Jewish people do, but I did and do. And so chapter 3 was very significant for me because it answers the questions that come up in the world, the fallen world in which we live. The second chapter I chose was Genesis chapter 12, a template for restoration. That's the story of Abraham, of the Ur of Chaldees being chosen by God as the unique person who would ultimately give the seed of the woman. The seed would be directed through Abraham, then Isaac, and Jacob. And the template for restoration was choosing a man, which God did, a man of faith, and then from him goes that seed. He, of course, is outlined later in the book of Hebrews. And so Genesis chapter 12, a time for restoration. Then 2 Samuel chapter 7, the king and the kingdom. I looked forward to a Messiah in the Jewish environment I was in. I believe the Messiah was coming in great power. I believe he'd be the Davidic Messiah. And so chapter 7 tells me that the king and the kingdom is the seed which will be eternal. Then the next chapter for me was Isaiah chapter 53. Isaiah chapter 53, as we said last week, almost every Jewish person I've ever met, not almost, every Jewish person I met, Isaiah 53 played a key role if they chose to receive Christ. Every testimony, not only from Jewish people, but certainly every Jewish person I met, Isaiah 53, it's the humbling of the Creator. He is the seed, the suffering Messiah, the one that Jewish theology, much of it doesn't really talk about. They talk about the conquering Messiah, but not the suffering Messiah. And Isaiah chapter 53, very significant in my life and a very important chapter. The first time I read it through was when I was 22 years old. Then the next chapter, number 5, was John chapter 1. John chapter 1 talks about the Memra and the Logos. John chapter 1, John wrote that gospel probably in the early 90s AD, and he really answered both the Gentiles and the Jews, both of them, concerning this unique person. The seed of Genesis chapter 3 is going to take on flesh and dwell among us. And it's a powerful chapter that speaks both to the Gentile philosophic community, if you will, as well as the Jewish people. Then Revelation chapter 19, the king returns. Chapter 19 talks about worship in heaven. And then, of course, starting in verse 11, the king returns. He's returning with his saints. He's coming in power and authority. And the seed of the woman, the one who would crush Satan, here in Revelation chapter 19, he comes with fire in his eyes, judging the earth, stopping the rebellion that goes on. And of course, the Jewish people, according to Zechariah, they'll look upon him whom they pierced. That is the king that they see. He's our king, and he's coming to earth to rule and reign for 1,000 years. And that, of course, Revelation chapter 21 is the overcomers. Revelation 21 is a new heaven and a new earth, and the time that I was promised in Hebrew school ultimately is Revelation chapter 21, a wonderful time, really eternity. And so those are my 7 chapters. And let's see. So now what I'd like to do, we had a few people text us, Chris, and so I'm going to start with that. And
Steve, you got a lot. You got a lot of great people who have commented. This is fantastic. You're going to love this.
All right. Well, I'm going to start with Daryl Belair. 4 days ago, texted us, and he has his 7 chapters. And you know, when you look, Chris, I'd like to have a conversation with you if you're available. You know, the chapter that Daryl took was Genesis chapter 15, and he calls it God's unconditional contract with Abraham. That's an interesting chapter, Chris. God puts Abraham to sleep, and man, does he do his Z's. He is snoring away, and something incredible happens. And Daryl, I really appreciate Genesis chapter 15. Abraham believed God, and it was imputed to him as righteousness. That takes place here. But when he puts him to sleep, only one person in this contract between God and Abraham walks through the pieces, the sacrifice. And that one person is a lighted lamp that goes through these pieces. Thus, the idea here is, you know, Chris, you just leased a car, didn't you? You just leased a car. And when you lease a car, they give you a contract, right?
Yep.
You have to sign your life away.
Oh, yeah.
You have to sign. But the worst thing they could do to you, Chris, if you do not live up to your end of the bargain on your lease, there'll be a man who will come who will repo your car. When you're sleeping at night, he's going to come, or she is, and your car was there, and then boom, it's gone. And it wasn't stolen, it was taken back. You know, when you mortgage a house, you sign papers. But in Genesis chapter 15, during that time, the contract was not repossessing, not taking back. You died, because the person the 2 people who agree on their contract or covenant, when they walk through the pieces together, they're saying, if we break this covenant, either one of us, the other one will die. And so what God did is he put Abraham to sleep, and he went through the pieces himself. Daryl, I really appreciate that. His second chapter, number 2.
Steve, can I say something about Genesis 15 too?
Yeah, go ahead.
I love Genesis 15 because I love that Abraham is honest with God about how he feels. I love that because he says to Abraham, Abraham says to God, you promised me all of these things, and now all of a sudden I don't have all of these things, God. What's going on? And God has to speak truth into this moment for Abraham. And it's an honest, sometimes it's taught me to just be open and honest with God. Sometimes, you know, we come, oh Lord, please forgive me, and And when really I want to be like Abraham, God, what is going on right now? I came out here and I don't have everything that you promised. And there are moments of great sorrow for Abraham and moments of great joy for Abraham. So anyway, those are just some things that I thought about when I thought of Genesis 15 as well.
And Steve, if I may jump in, it's Daryl here.
Yes.
And I just want to add one little expansion on that. It's basically God damned himself if he did not honor that contract. So I think, you know, that draws out further. You know, you've explained it very well, but if we see that extra little dimension that God damned himself.
I think you're it's yours. You're right.
Yeah.
I agree with you. Then Daryl did Isaiah chapter 53. Again, a chapter I've said for both Jewish and Gentile folks. It is the gospel in a chapter. It tells us about this person who's going to come and who is going to pay the price of sin, be our intercessor. Very difficult concept for the Jewish mind because we pride ourselves on going directly to God. We don't we don't use an intercessor. At least that's what we're taught. And the fact of the matter is there has to be an intercessor. And so Isaiah 53, a very important chapter. And then uniquely, Daryl chooses Ezekiel chapter 38 and 39. Now, he's counting that as one, so we'll give him that. That's no problem. It's Magog, it's Gog and Magog. It's a battle that's going to take place in the future. It's debated as to when that future is. Is it before the rapture of the church? Is it right after the rapture of the church? When is it? There's a lot of debate about that. But the key is we're seeing things like the nations lining up, staging even now. And it's very interesting because you believe, Daryl, that it triggers the first seal of Revelation 6. And that certainly could be the case. It's a tough one to know, but this is from Daryl. So we're not arguing. We're just sharing. Daniel chapter 9, Daniel's prayer for Israel and the revealing of the end timeline. You know, that's really neat. I was just listening, Daryl, to J. Vernon McGee. J. Vernon McGee, those of you who are younger might not know that name. J. Vernon McGee was actually the first person to disciple me on the radio. I used to, when I was living in California, I left at 6:30 in the morning, and every morning at 6:30, J. Vernon McGee would come, and when he talks about Daniel chapter 9, he describes it almost in a similar way that you do, Daryl, describing his prayer and the end time events that are going to take place. I could still hear J. Vernon in my head. Daniel chapter 9, if you could wrap your mind around these 70 weeks and really think about it, numbers of Friends of Israel, of course, Menno Kalisher has done extensive study on Daniel chapter 9. Sir Anderson was the one who did the math for it. Daniel chapter 9 outlines the powers, the future world powers that are going to line up, and the 69 weeks that have already passed, the time period of time that we didn't know about was this break that we're in now, and the 70th week is the one that coincides with Jeremiah chapter 30, the time of Jacob's trouble. So that's what Daryl did. Then John chapter 17, a great prayer. Christ's high priestly prayer. What an amazing thing that is. That prayer is an amazing prayer that Christ gives. And Ephesians chapter 1, Daryl's position in Christ. And then Revelation chapter 1, the very beginning, talks about the glorified Christ. So that's Daryl's.
And Steve, if I may, just
Yep.
jump in. If anyone can see my background, I'm trying
Yeah,
to move
there
out
it
of the
is.
way. There we go. That's an image I've created of Christ, and as best as I could, put all these symbols from Revelation 1 into that.
Daryl, hey, could you take a picture and send it to Chris? And if anybody wants it, maybe they could use it.
Or what I could do, Gabe, could I just upload the JPEG file to Thinkific?
Yeah, if that works, or email it to me.
Okay, I'll see if I can upload it. If not, then I'll contact you there. And yeah.
Oh, Daryl, that's very generous of you. Must be catching the fever of North American Ministries and Equip as you make it available to everyone. Very
Absolutely.
nice. Melody sent in hers 5 days ago, and here's her list. She starts off with Isaiah chapter 7 and verse 14. I love that verse. Therefore, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin shall conceive, bear a son, and shall call his name Emmanuel. Jesus was conceived by a virgin, a sign. Excellent start for Melody. Then her second one is Isaiah 53. Right, 100% so far on Isaiah 53. as she describes the Messiah very clearly in verse 5, says he was wounded for our transgression, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought peace, and by his stripes we are healed. He went through persecution, later on killed. Then the third one is Matthew chapter 24 and verse 5. For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. Many have claimed and lacked the attributes as described by Isaiah 53. Melody, for her story is to emphasize that there's only one, the promised one, the one and only Jesus Christ. And then 3, after his resurrection, Jesus meets 2 people going to a village called Emmaus. Discussing him, he says in Luke 24:25, he said unto them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things and enter into his glory? That is a great passage. I see those 2 Jewish guys walking along that street, that unpaved road, very upset at what happened. We thought it was him. And who greets them and walks with them? None other than the Christ himself. That's a great one. The next one is found in Luke chapter 24 and verse 44. Jesus says to the disciples, these are the words that I spoke to you while I was still with you, that everything that was spoken about me in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be fulfilled. Very interesting, Melody. That was my verse for the missions conference in Alabama, Huntsville. That was our weekend passage that I spoke from, reaching the nations for Messiah. So that's a great one. King David in Psalm 110, the Lord said unto my Lord, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. And number 6, Matthew 22:42, Jesus asked the Pharisees a question. What do you think about Christ? Great question. Then they said, the son of David. He then said to them, how is it then that David in the Spirit calls him Lord, saying, the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I put your enemies under your feet. Jesus here was establishing his deity. Great lesson. And again, I certainly relate to that. That was a key verse for me right before I got saved. In Mark chapter 14 and verse 61, Jesus being asked by the high priest, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? And he said, I am. And you'll see the Son of Man seated on the right hand of power, coming with the clouds of heaven. Jesus was quoting King David about the right hand of power in Psalm 110 and verse 1. All right, Chris.
Yeah. Can I read some of these to you, Steve, and you can comment on them?
100%.
All right, excellent. So we're going to go through a few of these here. And this is what I want our equippers to do. You know, this is a great time for taking in the Word of God and thinking about how it impacts somebody's life one chapter at a time. And so I'm so thankful to see all of these verses. Some of them are the same, and some of them are very different. And so I want to start with Emmeline here, Steve. I'm going to read all 7, and then you can comment on them. Emmeline did Deuteronomy chapter 6, Psalm 119, Luke chapter 2, Luke chapter 24, Romans chapter 11, and 1 Peter chapter 4, and Revelation chapter 19. And so I love, Steve, that Emmeline started with Deuteronomy chapter 6 as her first one.
Deuteronomy chapter 6. You know, Chris, the Jewish people invented devotions. You do know that, don't you? We
100%.
Invented devotions. In fact, I always tell people, especially, you know, from time to time through my years, I've struggled with devotions, especially when the schedule gets crazy and you've got kids and it's just crazy. You end up running out of the house and you didn't spend the time that you should have. A lot of people have that difficulty. And so who do they blame? Blame us. Because we're supposed to spend some time with God in the morning, first thing, then at noon, or sometime in the afternoon, and then at night. Deuteronomy chapter 6 is when when growing up, right after I was bar mitzvah, I would lay tefillin. That is, I would wrap leather straps around my left arm, and I would take the leather straps and with my 3 fingers wrap it around so that it would make the letter shin, the Hebrew letter shin, the first letter in the word Shema. And then I put that box on my head. I, of course, have a yarmulke, and I'd have a talit, the prayer shawl. And I'd be telling God, I love you with all my heart, all my soul, and all my strength. And God goes on to talk about in that chapter how we love him with all of our being, and we shall teach about him when we lie down, when we rise up, every time of the day. Use it as a teaching opportunity. That chapter is the declaration of faith for the Jewish people, and Emily captured that in her own life, because it certainly is written to the Jewish people in Israel, but it's certainly very applicable to the believer and could be as it was for Emily. I didn't catch all of them. The Romans 11, tell me the ones I missed, Chris. Romans 11, as Emily wrote about that one, that of
Emmeline.
course, Emmeline, I'm sorry. Emmeline, Romans 11 is the third of 3 important chapters. They're all important, but they're the hub of all of Romans. Romans chapter 9 talks about the privileges of Israel. Romans chapter 10, the present condition of Israel. And then Romans chapter 11, verse 26, all Israel will be saved. And in fact, he asks an interesting question, Chris, in Romans chapter 11, that I just love in a time that we live in, where there's a lot of anti-Semitism, and there's also replacement theology. And so the question is, has God cast away his people? I love that question in Romans 11 that Paul asks. And then the answer, in the New King James, it says certainly not, but I like much better, God forbid. That's a very Jewish thing. Oh yeah, I heard God forbid all the time. My mother, if something bad was said, like something bad's going to happen, she would say, God forbid, and then poo poo, she'd spit. Right there, she'd spit. And the reason you do that is it's kind of superstitious. But I am telling you, Paul wasn't superstitious, but the way in which he's describing this is the same thing. Because God rejected his people, God forbid, poo poo, may it never be. And then he goes on to give his testimony, Elijah's testimony as well, against the prophets.
Steve, I'm never going to forget that. May it never be poo poo. I'm never going to forget that now.
Well, you see, I passed it on. You could thank Blanche for that.
That's a Blanchism.
She gave it to me. May it never be, God forbid, poo poo. Revelation 19, we've already talked about that. It's, wouldn't you like Steven Spielberg to get that chapter, and let's see a movie built around the special. God is going to top Steven Spielberg, but I would love to see that with the technology we have. That would be amazing. Coming in glory and power with fire in his eyes, all the nations of the world gathered against him, and he but speaks the word, and boom, it's over. What were the other 2? I missed.
Well, Steve, I think what we'll do is we'll move on. So,
okay.
And what I'm going to do for everybody is, I believe when this is done, I can download the chat, and we can have Laura send it to everybody, and that will be the notes. Cool. So then everybody can see everybody's verses. Okay, so that'll be the goal that we're going to try to do, is make sure we get everybody's verses here. So even if you don't get yours mentioned tonight, everyone will have a chance to see them. So be sure to put them in there. Are you saying
they're participating? We're getting participation?
Steve, do you not see the many chats?
I've been talking the whole time. I haven't seen anything.
You got a ton. That's why I'm saying we got to move along here. We'll be here till 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon with all the great chapters here. All right, here, this is Chris and Beverly Benner. Genesis 1, Genesis 6 through 8. He gave you 3 there. Joshua 10, Daniel 9, Matthew 2, Hebrews 11, and Revelation 21, 22 through 22, verse 5. Steve, why don't you pick one out there that stands out to you?
Well, I'll
and
pick two
highlight
real
that.
quick. Genesis chapter 1, that's the beginning. In the beginning, God. You just, the moment you say you believe that, if you believe in the beginning God, then you could believe the whole rest of the book. Once you believe in the beginning God, then you're in. You're in. I can honestly say, in my story, that's it. In the beginning, God. And so I hope for her as well, in the beginning, God. But then Hebrews chapter 11, the Hall of Faith. I grew up about 40 miles, not even 40, 30 miles from Canton, Ohio, the Hall of Fame, the Football Hall of Fame. Great place to go, great place to take your family. I took my 2 boys a couple different times to the Hall of Fame. And that's great. We went to the Basketball Hall of Fame in Springfield. We went to, in Cooperstown, went to the Baseball Hall of Fame. I love all of them. But the Hall of Faith, now that's a hall. Abraham, David, Moses, that chapter, I'm telling you, Abraham believed, they all believed, and some of them believed unto death. It's a great chapter, Chris. And one, we probably should have a equipped course just on Hebrews chapter 11.
I think it's a great idea. You know what else reminds me of Hebrews 11, Steve, is in our recent Jew and Gentile podcast, we've had Pastor Neil on doing a lesson on Judges. And we were highlighting the fact that there are moments of ministry. And just because you're in the Hall of Faith doesn't mean you're perfect. But
Right.
in your life,
That's for sure.
Yeah. And so you can tell that there were people in that Hall of Faith. You go, wow, I'm surprised they made it in there. But the reality is that they had in key moments when God was calling them to do something, instead of backing away, they stepped out in faith to follow the Lord. It's even sometimes just boils down to the moment of faith when they trusted so that God could use them for an amazing moment. So I love that about the Hall of Faith.
Hey, the seed of the woman made it possible for the Hall of Faith.
That's exactly right. All right, here we go, Steve. I'm glad you picked out Hebrews chapter 11 there from the Benners. Thanks for participating there. All right, Captain Paul up there in Canada, he did Genesis 1, Psalm 139, Genesis 12, Psalm 121, John chapter 3, Revelation chapter 3, and Ephesians chapter 6. Steve, which one stands out from Captain Paul?
Captain Paul, would choose a chapter from the book of Psalms, 24 verses long, Psalm 139. Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my sitting down and my rising up. You understand my thoughts far off. You comprehend my path and my lying down. Paul, as he's in the summertime, he's on his boat all the time. I'm sure he contemplates Psalm 139 as he's on that, Lake, it's not Lake Superior, it's which
Ontario.
lake is it?
Ontario.
Yeah, Ontario. And here in verse 7, it says, where can I go from your spirit? That's what Jonah asked. Jonah's, I'm trying to get away from you. I can't get away anywhere. You're everywhere. You know everything. Paul, that's a great chapter, a great Psalm 139.
Can I add one thing?
Sure.
The name of my boat comes from Psalm 139, the wings of the morning.
Nice.
That's
Look at that
awesome.
flag that he's got too, Chris. Do you see Captain Paul?
Love Captain Paul. I see it. He's the man. He is the man. Thank you, Captain Paul. All right, this one comes from Jennifer Andre, Genesis chapter 1, Steve, 2 Chronicles 20, Psalm chapter 2, Psalm 91, Psalm 119, Romans chapter 8, and Romans chapter 19. Steve, what stands out to you there?
Psalm chapter 2. I love Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the people of a vain thing plot a vain thing? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and against his anointed, saying, let us break their bonds in pieces and cast away their cords from us. Here's what I love, Chris. He who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold them in derision. I love it. The idea of man against God. There's a show on Food Network called Man versus Food. And that show is where a guy takes a challenge and tries to conquer eating mass amounts of food. Some of them seem incredibly impossible, and some of them are. Sometimes food wins, sometimes man wins. He eats so much. Well, as I think of Psalm 2, there is no way that man could defeat God. The best that man has is not even the least of God. It's not even a thought of God. And that's why in Psalm 2, the Lord sees all that going on and he sits in heaven and he laughs. And then in verse 6, I have set my king on my holy hill of Zion. I will declare the decree. The Lord has said to me, you are my son. We've heard this before in the New Testament. Today I have begotten you. Great chapter, Chris.
All right, we got one more, Steve. There's a whole bunch, but I want to do one more, and I want to wrap up with your thoughts and my thoughts about these verses here. This comes from Kathleen, and she says Genesis 1, Genesis 12, Isaiah 53, Jeremiah 17, Daniel 3, Luke chapter 7, and Steve, you ready? 1 Thessalonians chapter 4.
1 Thessalonians chapter 4, the rapture of the church. I'll tell you today in Christendom, if you tell people, Christians, that you believe in the rapture, it's like you got leprosy. It's like what ship are you sailing on? The Apostle Paul is writing to the Thessalonians, and in context, Chris, he taught 3 weeks. He had 3 Sabbaths in Thessalonica. Could you imagine the Apostle Paul teaching? If he would be on equip for 3 straight weeks, teaching us the inspired word of God, his very words from Paul would be inspired, but they forgot some of the stuff he taught. They didn't have computers or recording. They forgot. So he has to write back to them and remind them of what he taught. And one of the things he taught was that there would be, in a sudden, quick way, and let me get to 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, because I want to make sure I have his exact words and not my own. But it says this, I don't want you to be ignorant. I love this. You know what they were? Ignorant. Whenever he says that, I don't want you to be. I did teach you, but you forgot. That really encourages me, Chris, because I've preached and taught. People forget right away what I say, most of the time because it's not worth remembering. But for Paul, when he says, I don't want you to be ignorant concerning those who have fallen asleep, lest you sorrow as others who have no hope. Oh, Chris, these words that he wrote to the Thessalonians were to provide them with hope. He is, according to Titus, our blessed hope. What a great chapter. What a great encouragement it is to believers to know that at any moment we could be absent from the body, present with him through death, or taken up in our body instantly, like Superman changed to a supernatural body to meet him in the air, and the resurrected, those who have died and gone before us will get there first. What a great chapter.
Well, Steve, I'm going to offer my thoughts and then you can close it out. When I see all these 7 chapters, something that stands out to me about our amazing FOI equippers here that are with us that put their 7 chapters out is that I believe they have a great handle on the whole counsel of God from Genesis to Revelation. Oftentimes, when we think about our salvation, it begins with our sin and it ends with Jesus on the cross and his death, burial, and resurrection. And that's great, and it's amazing, and it's true. But the thing that I love about our equippers here, Steve, is that they know that that's not the end just yet, that there's more prophetically, that our salvation isn't complete until Jesus returns. And our salvation goes from this process of sanctification to ultimately our glorification, that the story isn't over yet. Its story didn't just end at the cross. Its fulfillment will come when Jesus returns. And when I look over many, Steve, of these amazing verses that people have, that our equippers have put on here, they all have to do with the fact that Jesus is returning. And that, to me, gives me great hope to know that our equippers here have a great grip on the fact that they understand God's not through yet. He's coming back, and we're going to see these mortal bodies ultimately find immortality. We're going to go from corruptible to incorruptible. That is something very exciting for me.
Well, Chris, for me, it's actually, I've been encouraged, because when we talked about doing this, I knew I was going to do what I was going to do the first week, but it was kind of nebulous as to what was going to happen this week, because I was relying on our equippers here to participate. And you and I talked about it. We were so happy we had a few ahead of time, and I was able to go through them. But while I did a lot of talking, it seems that there was a lot of participation. People thought through their verses, their chapters, and really interacted with the text, which is really what Equip is all about. Whether they're lectures or things, exercises like we have now. And Chris, I think it's, to me, seeing what and hearing these verses, those people here who are taking this today, if you have not taken Bridges, you ought to be signing up for Bridges, because you'll be able to take your verses, you'll be able to learn things you might not certainly have not heard before, and then apply them in your life. And so, Chris, this whole experiment has been a great encouragement to me.